The stage for the catastrophe of 1939 was meticulously set 2 decades earlier by the very instrument intended to secure peace, the Treaty of Versailles, 1919. While celebrated as a victory by the Allies, its clauses, particularly those concerning Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, and the punitive reparations, created a systemic burden on the newly formed Weimar Republic. The financial obligations, coupled with the severe restrictions placed on German military capability, were not merely punitive. They were an economic and psychological anchor that fostered deep-seated resentment across the German political spectrum, paving the way for the rise of radical nationalism under Adolf Hitler. The process of rearmament, which began in earnest following Hitler's consolidation of power in 1933, was an exercise in bureaucratic obfuscation and calculated noncompliance. Tanks were officially designated as agricultural tractors, and pilot training schools were disguised as civil aviation initiatives, systematically and secretly violating the treaty's most detailed military restrictions. The international response was defined by the policy of appeasement, a diplomatic stance rooted in the sincere but ultimately flawed belief that minor concessions could prevent a larger war. This policy was tragically cemented by the inaction following the remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, a clear violation of Versailles and the Locarno treaties. The French and British decision not to enforce the existing treaties emboldened the Reich and validated its strategy of incremental aggression. The subsequent annexation of Austria in March 1938, Anschluss, was completed not with military opposition, but with a swift, legally questionable referendum and the tacit, nervous acceptance of the international community. This set the precedent for the Munich Agreement later that year. Here, the diplomatic core of the issue was the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned to London, famously proclaiming "peace for our time," clutching a signed document. What his document actually did, however, was dismantle Czechoslovakia's formidable border defenses, rendering the rest of the nation strategically vulnerable and demonstrating to Hitler the West's complete aversion to armed conflict. The final decisive bureaucratic maneuver before the war began was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, August 23, 1939. Publicly, this was a non-aggression agreement between the ideological enemies of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Its true significance lay in the secret protocol, a concise, technically worded addition that partitioned Eastern Europe into distinct spheres of influence. Poland was to be divided, along with the Baltic states and Finland. This single quiet document, signed late at night in Moscow, provided the strategic safety net Hitler required. With the assurance that the Wehrmacht would not face a two-front war, the invasion of Poland could proceed. The war officially began on September 1, 1939, following a manufactured border incident, a final, cynical piece of military bureaucracy. The German forces employed the revolutionary Blitzkrieg, lightning war doctrine, which combined speed, mobile armored units, and close air support to bypass entrenched defenses. The invasion was swift. 2 days later, fulfilling their earlier diplomatic guarantee, Britain and France declared war on Germany. However, their response was immediate inaction, leading to the bizarre period known as the Sitzkrieg, or Phony War, a period defined by bureaucratic mobilization and anticipation rather than fighting along the Franco-German border. The quiet was only broken when the Soviet Union, honoring the terms of the secret protocol, invaded Poland from the east on September 17, 1939, securing their pre-agreed territorial gains and effectively sealing Poland's fate. The conclusion of the phony war in the spring of 1940 marked the end of diplomatic posturing and the beginning of a war defined by logistical speed and administrative occupation. The German invasions of Denmark and Norway, Operation Weserübung, on April 9, 1940, are often dramatized as daring naval operations. However, from a boring history perspective, these invasions were primarily motivated by a single industrial statistic: iron ore supply security. Germany was heavily dependent on Swedish iron ore, shipped through the Norwegian port of Narvik during winter. The British attempt to mine these waters, Operation Wilfred, was a legal violation of Norwegian neutrality intended to strangle German industry. Germany's preemptive strike was, essentially, an aggressive act of supply chain management to secure the raw materials necessary for steel production. On May 10, 1940, the war in the West began in earnest. The fall of France is historically significant not just for the speed of the German victory, but for the catastrophic failure of the Allied command and control structure. The French military possessed more tanks and arguably better heavy artillery than the Wehrmacht. Their defeat was rooted in a rigid, centralized communication bureaucracy that relied on couriers rather than radio, making real-time tactical adjustments impossible. The German Wallenstein plan exploited this by sending armored divisions through the Ardennes, a region listed in French bureaucratic assessments as impassable. The resulting armistice of June 22, 1940, signed in the same railway carriage where Germany had surrendered in 1918, was a masterclass in punitive administration. It did not merely end hostilities, it partitioned France into a German-occupied zone in the north and west, and a theoretically independent free zone in the south governed from Vichy. Article 19 of this document required the French government to surrender any German nationals, political refugees, in France upon demand, a bureaucratic clause that turned the French state into an administrative accomplice of the Nazi regime. Financially, France was forced to pay the occupation costs of the German army, a massive daily transfer of wealth that effectively subsidized Germany's war effort. With continental Europe secured, the conflict shifted to the Battle of Britain. While remembered for aerial dogfights, the British victory was actually secured by a superior information management system. The Dowding system was a complex network of radar stations, chain home, observer corps, and telecommunications that centralized data at fighter command. This allowed British commanders to treat air defense as a logistical problem, allocating specific resources, squadrons, to specific vectors only when necessary, preserving pilot stamina and fuel. The German Luftwaffe, lacking a comparable strategic heavy bomber fleet or a coherent long-term industrial target list, shifted focus from airfields to cities, the Blitz, a strategic error that allowed British defensive infrastructure to recover. Simultaneously across the Atlantic, the United States was engaging in its own form of bureaucratic warfare. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, constrained by the Neutrality Acts and strong isolationist sentiment, maneuvered through legal loopholes to support Britain. The culmination of this was the Lend-Lease Act, H.R. 1776, signed in March 1941. This legislation effectively ended the pretense of American neutrality by allowing the president to sell, transfer title to, exchange, lease, lend, or otherwise dispose of defense articles to any government deemed vital to the defense of the United States. It was an economic declaration of war, turning American industrial capacity into the arsenal of democracy without technically deploying a single soldier. In the Mediterranean, Italy's disastrous, uncoordinated invasion of Greece in October 1940 forced Germany to intervene in the Balkans to secure its southern flank before the planned invasion of Russia. This intervention, though militarily successful, imposed a critical logistical delay of several weeks on the start of Operation Barbarossa. In the grand timeline of the war, this administrative adjustment to the timetable, delaying the invasion of the Soviet Union from May to June, would have profound consequences as the Wehrmacht raced against the onset of the Russian winter. The strategic delay caused by the unexpected Balkan campaign pushed the start date of Operation Barbarossa to June 22, 1941. While conventional military history focuses on the sheer number of divisions involved, over 3 million Axis troops, the true failure of the invasion was preordained in the railway engineering manuals of the respective nations. The Soviet Union operated on a broad gauge, 1,524 millimeters, whereas Germany used the standard European gauge, 1,435 millimeters. This seemingly minor 89 millimeter difference was a logistical catastrophe. German supply trains could not physically enter Russia without the tracks being laboriously relayed, or the rolling stock being changed at the border transfer stations. This created a massive bottleneck at the very moment the Wehrmacht needed speed. As the German spearheads advanced hundreds of miles into the Soviet interior, their supply lines were forced onto primitive dirt roads. When the autumn rains arrived, creating the Rasputitsa, the season of mud, the horse-drawn supply wagons, which, contrary to the myth of a fully mechanized army, still formed the logistical backbone of the Wehrmacht, sank into the mire. The advance halted not simply because of Soviet resistance or the cold, but because the German logistical tail snapped under the geographic weight of the operation. Simultaneously, behind the front lines, the Nazi regime was formalizing the bureaucracy of genocide. On January 20th, 1942, a meeting was convened at a villa in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee. The Wannsee conference lasted only about 90 minutes. It was not a debate on policy, it was an implementation meeting for the final solution to the Jewish question. 15 high-ranking officials, including Reinhard Heydrich and Adolf Eichmann, sat around a table to coordinate the administrative logistics of mass murder. The surviving protocol of this meeting is a masterpiece of detached, administrative euphemism. It does not speak of killing, it speaks of evacuation to the east, reduction through labor, and special treatment. They calculated the rail capacity required to transport 11 million Jews from across Europe to extermination camps in Poland, treating human beings as mere tonnage to be processed. This meeting transformed genocide from a chaotic series of massacres into a state-run, factory-line process, complete with timetables and budget allocations. On the other side of the globe, The road to war in the Pacific was being paved with economic sanctions and diplomatic notes. Following Japan's expansion into French Indochina, the United States, along with Britain and the Netherlands, imposed a total embargo on oil and scrap metal exports to Japan. For an island nation that imported 80% of its oil from the U.S., this was a mathematical death sentence for its navy and industry. The Japanese decision to go to war was driven by a calculated window of diminishing returns. Their strategists estimated they had only 18 months of oil reserves left. The diplomatic breaking point came with the Hull Note of November 26, 1941. Presented by U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull, the document demanded Japan's complete withdrawal from China. To the Japanese cabinet, this was not a negotiation proposal, but an ultimatum that threatened their status as a great power. The attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, was a tactical masterpiece but a strategic blunder of the highest order. Admiral Yamamoto's plan neutralized the U.S. battleships, but it failed to target the logistical infrastructure. The oil tank farms, holding 4.5 million barrels of fuel, the dry docks, and the submarine pens were left intact. Had these been destroyed, the U.S. Pacific Fleet would have been forced to retreat to the California coast for months, buying Japan the time it needed. Instead, the U.S. Navy was able to operate from Hawaii almost immediately. Furthermore, the attack solved President Roosevelt's insurmountable political problem: isolationism. The declaration of war that followed mobilized the world's largest industrial economy. The American response was not just military, it was a production miracle. The War Production Board was established to micromanage the U.S. economy, banning the production of civilian automobiles to focus entirely on tanks and planes. The U.S. economy effectively became a single, massive factory dedicated to the war effort. The turning point in the Pacific War came 6 months later at the Battle of Midway, June 1942, and it was a victory won not by firepower, but by information assurance. The U.S. Navy's Cryptanalysis Unit, Station Hypo, led by Joseph Rochefort, had partially cracked the Japanese naval code, JN-25B. They intercepted references to an impending attack on a location codenamed AF. Suspecting it was Midway, they sent a fake unencrypted message stating that Midway's water distillation plant had failed. The Japanese intercepted this and broadcasted to their fleet that AF is short of water. This intelligence confirmation allowed Admiral Nimitz to place his carriers in a perfect ambush position. The subsequent sinking of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers was a blow to the human capital of the Imperial Japanese Navy. They lost their most experienced pilots and mechanics, a specialized workforce that their rigid, quality-focused training bureaucracy could never replace. By the middle of 1942, the conflict had fully transitioned into a war of industrial statistics. The United States began the mass production of the Liberty ship, a class of cargo vessel designed for rapid construction. Using prefabricated sections and welding instead of slow riveting, the production time for a single ship dropped from 244 days to an average of 42 days. This meant the Allies could launch ships faster than German U-boats could sink them, turning the Battle of the Atlantic into a mathematical inevitability. By the latter half of 1942, the conflict had transitioned from a war of maneuver to a gruesome war of attrition, where the outcome was determined not by tactical brilliance, but by the mathematics of supply chains. This shift was tragically demonstrated at Stalingrad. Following the Soviet encirclement in Operation Uranus, November 1942, the German Sixth Army was trapped. The refusal to break out was based on a strategic delusion supported by a fatal bureaucratic miscalculation. Field Marshal Göring promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe could sustain the army by air, guaranteeing a daily delivery of 500 tons. In reality, facing fierce anti-aircraft fire and the onset of winter, the Luftwaffe averaged barely 90 tons a day. The soldiers inside the cauldron were not just fighting the Soviets, they were fighting a caloric deficit. By January 1943, the daily ration for a German soldier had dropped to less than 200 grams of bread, leading to mass starvation and the eventual surrender of Field Marshal Paulus, a defeat dictated purely by the failure of the air logistics system. The Battle of the Atlantic, the crucial logistical prerequisite for victory, was simultaneously being won through technology and intelligence. The Allies methodically closed the mid-Atlantic gap, an area beyond the range of land-based air cover. The solution was threefold: the deployment of VLR, very long-range aircraft, the effective use of centimetric radar to detect submarine periscopes, and Huff-Duff, high-frequency direction finding, to triangulate U-boat radio transmissions. Crucially, the code breakers at Bletchley Park continually broke the German naval enigma cipher, Shark, allowing Allied convoys to be routed around known U-boat concentrations. This combination of advanced intelligence and technology drastically reduced tonnage losses, securing the shipping lanes necessary for the buildup of invasion forces in Britain. The air war over Europe was formalized by the Casablanca Directive, January 1943, and the subsequent Point-Blank Directive. These official documents established a precise bureaucratic priority list for destruction: German submarine yards, aircraft industry, and oil plants. The resulting combined bomber offensive saw the British bombing by night and Americans by day, designed to impose maximum economic disruption. The firestorm of Operation Gomorrah in Hamburg demonstrated the calculated efficiency of this campaign. Its strategic effect was twofold. It forced German Minister of Armaments Albert Speer to decentralize industry, reducing efficiency, and, more importantly, it compelled the Luftwaffe to recall its fighter squadrons from the Eastern Front to defend the homeland skies. This administrative reallocation of resources stripped the Wehrmacht of vital air cover at the moment they needed it most in Russia. On the Eastern Front, the Battle of Kursk, July 1943, demonstrated the final transition to a German defensive posture. The Soviets, forewarned by intelligence, constructed a defensive network of unprecedented engineering complexity, up to 8 defensive belts deep, featuring 3,000 miles of trenches and an average of 2,400 anti-tank mines per mile of front. When the German Operation Citadel launched, it was not a maneuver battle. It was a grinding attrition against prepared fortifications. The failure cost Germany its last strategic armored reserves, solidifying that the war would henceforth be fought on Soviet terms. In the Mediterranean, the Allied invasion of Sicily triggered the collapse of Italian fascism. The Armistice of Cassabile, signed secretly on September 3, 1943, was a chaotic diplomatic event. When it was announced publicly on September 8, the Italian army, lacking clear orders, disintegrated. The Germans, anticipating this betrayal, swiftly launched Operation Axii, disarming over 1 million Italian soldiers and occupying the peninsula. The subsequent Italian campaign was defined not by strategy, but by the German mastery of defensive demolition. systematically destroying bridges, tunnels, and roads to impose maximum calculated logistical delays on the Allied advance, tying up massive Allied manpower and material resources. The final phase of the war began with the greatest logistical undertaking in human history, Operation Overlord D-Day, June 6, 1944. The success of the Normandy landings relied less on combat than on supply chain innovation. The Allies solved the problem of supplying an army without capturing a port by towing their own. The Mulberry harbors, massive concrete caissons assembled off the French coast to feed the insatiable fuel demand of mechanized units. Engineers laid Pluto, pipelines under the ocean, pumping fuel directly from Britain to France. Once ashore, the breakout was sustained by the Red Ball Express, a continuously looping truck convoy system that operated 24/7. This logistical velocity overwhelmed the German defense, which was paralyzed by a rigid, hierarchical command structure requiring Hitler's personal authorization for key decisions. While the world watched Normandy, a far larger catastrophe for Germany unfolded in the East. On June 22, 1944, the Soviets launched Operation Bagration. The deception planning, Maskirovka, was so thorough that German intelligence wrongly concentrated its reserves in the south. The Soviet offensive obliterated 28 of the 34 divisions of Army Group Center, tearing a 250-mile wide hole in the German lines. Statistically, Bagration was the greatest military defeat in German history, costing them nearly 500,000 men in weeks, a strategic annihilation far exceeding the losses at Stalingrad. As the Allied armies converged, the post-war geopolitical bureaucracy was being established. At the Yalta Conference, February 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met to manage a liquidation. They formally agreed upon the division of Germany into 4 zones of occupation and discussed the administrative fate of Eastern Europe. This included the infamous Percentages Agreement, where spheres of influence, like 90% Soviet influence in Romania, were informally confirmed, determining the geopolitical architecture of the next 50 years before the war had technically ended. The subsequent Potsdam Conference finalized the administrative details, including war reparations and the displacement of millions of people to new national boundaries. The war in Europe concluded with a chaotic series of surrenders in May 1945. However, the end in the Pacific came from the most expensive scientific bureaucracy in history, the Manhattan Project. Costing $2 billion, equivalent to over $30 billion today, and employing 130,000 people, it was a vast, secret industrial complex. The decision to drop the atomic bombs was driven by grim actuarial tables. The projected U.S. casualties for an invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, were estimated in the hundreds of thousands, a staggering cost in human capital the U.S. government sought to avoid. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki transformed the nature of warfare instantly. Strategic destruction no longer required years of industrial effort, but could be achieved by a single device. On September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, the Japanese foreign minister signed the instrument of surrender. It was a brief, formal bureaucratic ceremony involving leather-bound documents and fountain pens. This act officially ended the most destructive conflict in human history, transitioning the world from the violence of total war to the tense, documented standoff of the nuclear age and the complex administrative challenges that would define the Cold War.